Hi guys, and welcome back. So you've now studied how parliamentary democracy came into Germany. You've examined its difficult birth during military defeat, the nature of the new revolution that created the Weimar Republic, and also the new democratic constitution, which had been established and approved by the Constituent Assembly in August 1919. So what you now need to do is decide whether the background and events of 1918 to 1919 doomed the new republic to failure, or whether it still had a chance of establishing a long-lasting democracy in Germany. Will the constitution survive? The Constitution of Weimar was in many ways more democratic than the system of government in force at the time in other democratic countries. It also marked a clear break with Germany's autocratic past. If we look at the strengths of the Constitution, well, firstly, it provided a wider right to vote than countries such as Great Britain and France. Women were allowed to vote on the same terms as men, which we also refer to as universal suffrage, and they were also allowed to become deputies in the Reichstag and state departments. Secondly, the system of proportional representation enabled even the smaller parties to win seats in the Reichstag and influence government decisions. And I'll go into explain that later on in this video. And the country was also divided into 35 electoral districts, each with about 1 million voters. There was also full democracy in local government as well as central government, and unlike in the Second Empire, the largest state, Prussia, was no longer in a position to dominate the rest of Germany. The Constitution also clearly sets out the rights of the individual. The fundamental rights and duties of German citizens is a separate part of the Constitution, and it guaranteed things like all Germans are equal before the law, personal liberty is inviolable, censorship is forbidden, all inhabitants enjoy full religious freedom, and it gave illegitimate children also the same rights as legitimate ones, and promised economic freedom for the individual. So along with welfare provisions also being made. And finally, the president, the Reichsrat, or by people's request, could call for a referendum if 1/10 of the electorate applied for one. Okay, incredibly democratic principle that. We also can't underestimate the actual spirit of the Constitution, which is overall democratic and progressive. However, and this is quite a crucial however, there were innate issues ingrained within the structure and the system of the Constitution, which actually threatened its survival. Firstly, proportional representation was used as the voting system rather than the first past the post system, for example, like what we have in Britain today. And if you look behind me, this diagram shows the UK 2019 election results using first past the post. And you can see a blue Conservative majority with Labour second, Liberal Democrats in the yellow there, and also some of the Green Party you can see as well. However, proportional representation was actually designed to ensure that all shades of political opinion were represented in the Reichstag, since parties were allocated seats in proportion to the percentage of voters that they received in an election. Now, this is a very fair system. However, it had two clear consequences. The first being the proliferation of small parties. This meant that smaller parties could gain representation in the Reichstag, something that doesn't actually usually happen in a system of elections based on first past the post principle. If you look and take Britain as an example, then if you see behind me, you can see far more seats have been given to these smaller parties, and the Conservative majority is actually no longer. This is still the same election results, just shown in a different format. So in 1919 Germany then, it enabled smaller parties, much of which were anti-Republican, to exploit the parliamentary system to gain publicity. Just a note here actually that's important is we have to remember that proportional representation didn't actually in itself create the fragmented party system. This was actually due to long-lasting underlying deep divisions in German society and the lack of a national consensus, probably based on the fact that Germany is such a new nation. The second consequence involves coalition governments. Now, because of the proliferation of smaller parties, none of the large parties could gain an overall majority in the Reichstag. So since governments had to command majority support in the Reichstag, all governments in the Weimar Republic were coalitions, many of which were very short-lived. That being said, there are also counter-arguments against this, because it's difficult to see how an alternative voting system could have made for a more effective parliamentary democracy. The parties were meant to reflect the different political, religious, and geographical views within the disparate German society at the time. And so a system of proportional representation was the only fair way. It may also have been the case that the first past the post system would have actually helped the rise of Nazism or communism. Okay, so thinking back to another of the inherent issues with the Constitution, one of which was Article 48 of the Constitution, which allowed the elected president to rule by presidential decree in a state of emergency. And the article actually stated that if public security and order are seriously disturbed or endangered within the German Reich, the president of the Reich may take measures necessary for their restoration, intervening if need be with the assistance of the armed forces. Now, what this did is technically gave the president the power to rule by decree in exceptional circumstances and therefore undermine the Reichstag. And the granting of such powers, though, we need to remember, wasn't actually that remarkable in itself. Indeed, all democratic constitutions allow for an executive authority to use exceptional powers in a time of national emergency. What wasn't anticipated, though, was that its powers would be used on a regular basis. However, President Friedrich Ebert used the Article 48 on 136 occasions. And some of these occasions could be deemed to be genuine emergencies, but he also used his power in non-emergency situations, simply to override the opposition of the Reichstag. So there was no effective safeguards against this, since a president could actually threaten to dissolve the Reichstag and call new elections if it refused to agree to a presidential decree. Again, another ironic moment here, that Ebert, the leading voice for parliamentary democracy in 1918 to 1919 in the revolutionary upheavals, should, as president, actually undermine democracy through his overuse of the Article 48. And finally, there was still the survival of undemocratic institutions. Key social, administrative, and judicial structures that remained unchanged, and in some cases actually hostile to the new republic. So these included the power of the landed elites, the military, the civil service, and the judiciary. In the Second Empire, these elements were key pillars of the regime. Army officers, civil servants, and judges were recruited from the aristocracy, supported the autocracy, and looked with disdain on democratic politicians. They would not therefore fit easily into the new democratic republic. An opportunity existed for the architects of the new constitution to reform these institutions, but because they placed the need for stability above the desire for a thoroughly democratic system of government, they didn't do so. So the first pillar I want to discuss is the army. Now, it had been largely free from political control in the Second Empire, and its leaders were determined to preserve as much independence as they could in Weimar. The officer corps of the army in the Second Empire was allowed to continue intact to the new republic, with the result that the army was far from being politically neutral. The full force of military power would be used against the left-wing revolts, while conspirators from the right wing were often supported by elements within the army. General Hans von Seeckt, who was appointed commander-in-chief of the army in 1920, actually believed that the army owed loyalty not to the Republic, which he regarded as merely temporary, but actually to a timeless Reich that was the true expression of German nationhood. Although he would not allow his officers to meddle in politics on their own initiative, he nevertheless believed that the army as a whole and under his command could intervene in politics whenever he saw fit. Secondly, the civil service. Under the Weimar Constitution, civil servants were given a guarantee of their well-earned rights and of their freedom of political opinion and expression, as long as this didn't conflict with their duty of loyalty to the state. This meant that government administration in the new republic was left in hands of those who were anti-democratic in their outlook. And senior civil servants, especially in the German Foreign Office, for example, were still recruited overwhelmingly from the aristocracy. And top civil servants could actually wield enormous power, especially when ministers in coalition governments were frequently changing. Thirdly, and finally, an issue with the judiciary. Article 54 of the Constitution guaranteed the independence of the judges. Now, this would be a basic requirement in any democratic constitution, but in Weimar Germany, the judges who had served the Second Empire remained in their posts. These men were, staunch monarchists and anti-democratic, and showed their bias in their legal judgments. The Penal Code of the Republic stipulated that anyone attempting to overthrow the constitution by force should be sentenced to life imprisonment. Now, members of the left-wing groups who were brought before the courts were punished with great severity. Interestingly, right-wing conspirators, on the other hand, were actually treated very leniently. So just to recap there, the three key weaknesses inherent of the Weimar Constitution are proportional representation, rule by presidential decree, the Article 48, and also the survival of undemocratic institutions. Overall, it seems that the Constitution was fatally flawed in some respects. In terms of whether or not Weimar was doomed from the beginning, then there is much evidence, as we've looked at in terms of the Constitution itself and the way it was written. But also, we must consider the legacy of the First World War and the nature of the German Revolution, all of which also contributed to the downfall of democracy. We haven't even mentioned yet the continuing threats from the left and the right wing, because the left were feeling betrayed and the right, supporters of the Kaiser, blamed the leaders of the November Revolution for the humiliation of military defeat and for the illegal overthrow of the monarchy. So in the eyes of the right, the German army hadn't been defeated on the battlefield in 1919, but had actually been stabbed in the back by the revolution in Berlin. For them, the republic which owed its existence to that revolution was actually illegitimate and deserved to be overthrown. As the historian William Carr has written, the republic was accepted by Germans not as a superior form of government, but as a convenient means of filling the voids left by the collapse of the monarchy.